Thank you everyone for joining us today for our workshop called Meet the Editors, Tips for Writing Successful Op-Ed Pitches. I'm Debbie Carr. I'm a professor of sociology and director of CISS, and I'm thrilled that we have a fantastic panel here today. The session will have a series of questions from our panelists, and we'll have plenty of time for Q&A for all the participants who I see hopping into our Zoom right now. Before I start and toss things over to co-host Ariane Church, I just wanted to thank our center administrator, Shannon Landis, for organizing this event with us, and to our communications intern, Katja Rodvi, who has done all the PR to alert folks to this really important workshop. And we are thrilled to have our panel of editors here today because, as many of us are feeling, the social scientists are under siege, and the work we're doing really is more important than ever. And a climate that feels increasingly hostile. So the research we do and our capacity to speak to broader audiences really is tremendously important today. At CISS in the past, we've had workshops with faculty members and graduate students who are op-ed writers who talk about their experience in writing. But what Ariane and I thought would be really helpful is to hear from the editors themselves. What kind of pitch grabs your attention? What works, what doesn't? What advice do you have for those who are both seasoned op-ed writers and those who are hoping to break in? So we are thrilled that we have our panel here today. Just a reminder, this session will be recorded and it will be available only through a password protected site at CISS. So that way folks who aren't here today can listen at a later date, and those of you who are multitasking can listen and take notes also at a future date. So without further ado, I will pass our mic over to Dean Ariane Chernock, who will say a few words and then introduce our panelists.
Well, thank you, Debbie, for organizing this panel, and thank you to our panelists, of course, for agreeing to participate, and to all of you who are Zooming in, and for those who listen to the recording at a later time. As Debbie just said, we're in this this moment of tremendous uncertainty right now, and I think that in this particular moment, partnerships between scholars and journalists are particularly important and potentially quite powerful. So I think the more that we can collaborate and work together to find the right spaces for expert knowledge that's verifiable and verified in these trustworthy news sites, it's something that we can all do at this moment. And so I really encourage the faculty and graduate students who are listening to think about ways in which you can use the knowledge you gain today to amplify your research in ways that might really matter. And of course, the panelists that we've gathered today know about this firsthand, and it's such a pleasure to have the three of you in this Zoom room with us. And I really thank you in advance for giving time on what I'm sure is an incredibly busy Wednesday afternoon. So without further ado, I will introduce our panelists briefly, and then we will turn to questions with lots of time for discussion with the audience. So first we have Brian Bergstein joining us. Brian is the editor of the Ideas section of the Boston Globe. And he is also a member of the Globe's editorial board. Prior to that role, he was the executive editor of the MIT Technology Review. That publication was twice nominated for a National Magazine Award in general excellence, which is an incredible accomplishment. We also have Katie Brownell joining us. Katie is the senior editor of Made by History, hosted by Time Magazine. She is also a historian at Purdue University, and I have to add, one of our favorite PhDs in history from BU, a BU alum, which is remarkable. So it's been lovely to trace your career trajectory. So thank you for joining us. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Made by History, it's a leading history column that produces rigorous historical analysis of, I guess, primarily US current events, but global as well in scope, engages in public debates, offering an easily digestible format for the general public. So ways for scholars to share their research in ways that are accessible. And then last but certainly not least, we have Beth Daley joining us. Beth is the executive editor and general manager of The Conversation. The Conversation is a nonprofit independent news organization that is dedicated to unlocking the knowledge of experts for the public good. This is an incredible collaboration, I think shows it's a prime example of how universities partner with news to really get our stories out there. I've worked with The Conversation and really been impressed, I have to say, by the ways in which your team has helped me to craft stories and to think about the best ways to package ideas where people are actually possibly going to read about them. So Beth, prior to working at The Conversation, was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for climate reporting at the Boston Globe, and has also worked at the New England Center for Investigative Reporting. There's much more I could say about all of the panelists, but I think I'll leave it at that for now, and perhaps more will come up later in the Q&A. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you. And again, welcome. And we're really eager to have a conversation today. The way we'll have our session flow is that Ariana and I will each pose a question, and we'll have each of our three editors weigh in. They can disagree with one another, expand, agree. And so we'll go through maybe 7 or 8 questions, and then we will open the floor to questions from audience members, but also our editor panelists. If you have thoughts that we have not covered, we are more than eager to hear them. So it's semi-scripted. So here goes. I'll ask my first question. And I think for the first round, we'll go kind of alphabetically with Brian, Kathryn, and then Beth. And then we'll just keep having a different person kick off on each. But it should be very free-flowing, so feel free to weigh in with whatever thoughts are. So the first question is kind of a very general one. Could you briefly describe what you or the site that you work with looks for in an op-ed pitch? So can you briefly describe the procedure first of how someone would go about making such a pitch if they've never done this before? So how do they start? And then what are you looking for?
Yeah, I think this is a great question to pose to all three of us, because I think my section, it might be a little unusual, and I'd hate to have my advice be taken as sort of like a general advice about pitching, a whole range of publications. But I would just say, so at Ideas at the Boston Globe, we're a subsection of the opinion department. And in addition to the publication that we put out every Sunday in the paper, and we put these stories headed for the Sunday paper, they go out online, usually about a rate of 1 or 2 a day during the week. We're looking for something that's a little bit different from a typical op-ed. Some of what we do clearly feels like an op-ed and it overlaps, but there are other editors who handle more, I don't want to say conventional op-eds, but pieces that might be more recognizable as, an op-ed in terms of like the more classic like length and form. Anyway, that said, when we take pitches from experts in the social sciences or any other academic expertise, we're looking for something that is a little bit surprising and meets readers at a point of possible persuasion. So it's not easy to kind of like thread that needle. But what I mean by that is, especially now when there's so many things to react to in the world, we could fill the section, all day long with pieces that tell people, thing that just happened in the news is terrible for reasons X, Y, and Z. And like, that's true. But if it's kind of just likely to reassure the reader that what they already think is true, the value is probably not that great. If there's a new way of thinking about something, it's terrible. This thing that happened in the news is terrible, but it's because of this thing you may not even be considering, or this thing that's going to happen is something to look out for. Now we're starting to get into the realm of like what's a little bit more surprising. So I don't want to take too much time, but I would just say that what we're really looking for is something that feels a little like, aha, that's surprising. And it doesn't necessarily have to speak to something in the news. I'm actually hesitant to even prescribe too much of a formula, because so much of this stuff defies formula. And like when a good piece comes in, like we know it when we see it. But I would just say that it's something that like there's something about it that's likely to cause a little bit of friction in the reader's mind, like, oh, I never thought of it that way before. I didn't know that. And we try to get away from, pieces that feel a little too like eat your vegetables. So I should stop there and let the others talk, but that's the highest level way we think about it.
Great, thank you. And can I just add kind of the other kind of simpler question? If someone wanted to submit, is it just they submit kind of a cold call, or do they need a point of entree or a contact?
We have an open submissions mailbox, ideas@globe.com.
Great, thank you. And
Yeah.
so next, was it Kathryn or Katie? You had
I go by Katie. But
a
yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for organizing this. And thank you so much to Ariane for inviting me. As a BU alum, I love participating in anything that can support BU students and faculty. The history department at Boston University, where I did my PhD, has been very supportive of public-facing writing. And that's very rare. And I think that has really shaped my own career and my own commitment to it, because I think so much of the programming, the scholarly programming that happens at BU is thinking about the relevance of the work that we do. And that translates into workshops like this. And so I think really investing time to develop these professional skills are really essential for us as scholars, particularly at this moment. I'm one of the editors and co-founders of Made by History, and we launched that in 2017, very purposefully, because it was after the 2016 election when we saw the manipulation and the weaponization of history for partisan and ideological purposes. And we noted that the people who were cited as historians were actually not historians, and that they were manipulating history and misrepresenting the past. And we really wanted to expand the reach and the perspectives that were drawn in, and really emphasize the work that professional historians are doing. We felt that was really good for our profession, by really asserting that this is what history looks like. It also played a really important role, I think, in civic discourse as well. But there are also a lot of professional benefits that this type of work gives to our authors, and I'm happy to talk about that later on. Just as a professor who has had to climb the ranks of promotion, that I've been able to weave this into my trajectory in really strategic ways. So I'm happy to talk about that. But because we focus on history, we're looking for new takes on history. And I think Brian really nailed it, like at exactly what we're looking for as well. Something that makes us think differently. We always kind of focus on this question of why history matters. What's the backstory that we might not think about to a particular topic? And I think that really extends beyond disciplines. And that's something that academics can really provide, is that backstory to a broader issue. And so I think kind of the challenge for academics, I think, tends to be of not just making a scholarly argument about this is what my research shows, but directly connecting it to, and this is why it matters, right? This is why it matters for someone who isn't inherently interested in history or economics or sociology. Why is that your research? Why does it matter to this very busy mom that only has 10 minutes to read an article? Why should she pick your particular article? And so I think that tends to be, you first have to, before you grab a reader, you have to grab an editor who, again, is not always drawn to your discipline. You have to kind of show why your research and your way of thinking about something is really essential to and overlooked. And so you're kind of making that argument that it's so you can't understand this particular topic until you think about it historically. And so I think that's really what you're doing in the pitch for us as well. And in the basics in terms of how to pitch, we also have an email that is just made by history@time.com. That goes to all three. We have three senior editors, and then we have several other editors that do second. We'll talk about the process later on, but that goes into all of our inboxes. So we all see that immediately, and so that's a way to kind of get on all of our radar.
Great, terrific, thank you. And now Beth from The Conversation, which I am a fan of writing for. So we're eager.
Yeah, thanks so much, and for focusing on it. I'm really grateful. So there's a common theme that we're all talking about is making people think. There are a lot of opinion pages out there that are just screeds, and just people who are not even experts tend to just spout their opinion, and you can those when you see them, right? They're emotional. They lead with the finding, and emotional finding really high up. But what all our three organizations do is different, and I'd say better overall. The conversation special sauce is, again, relevance is really important. We really try to find timely evidence-based analysis of issues making the news. So it used to be a long time ago, we didn't really cover the news, but we just like Kathryn's group is we look at the news and say, where can we add something different? Where can we come in with a different angle, historical angle, a contextual angle, something that the world may want to know about, but they don't know they need to know about it. Like when Russia, I'm just as old now, but when Russia invaded Ukraine, we did a story on appropriation and why people called the Ukraine, which it was called for so long. So just little twist on news. We also really lean into articles that explain new research and its significance to a non-expert, to the general public. So, and it can be curious and it can be serious. It can be, hey, which we ran, I discovered a new color blue. A new color blue, why does it matter? It's kind of cool, it's curious, but it also has a lot of resonance for mass spectrometry, actually. So those two things. And then we do a lot, especially lately, just explainers, very simple. Well, they're not simple to do, but they come out simple about like, what does the Department of Education do? You know what I mean? Why are clinical trials, what are the different types of clinical trials? Explaining the world as it gets more complex to the average lay reader. We really try hard, and we tell people we don't publish opinion or advocacy. Quite honestly, if you read our stories, you'll find, hopefully, sometimes, rarely, a muted opinion, you know what I mean, at the end of the article, but it's usually based on expertise and research. So we lay that all out very simply. We're pretty more formulaic, I'd say, than most sites. And that's because of our reach is pretty profound, where we reach about 1,000 news outlets a month, and our republishers require certain things such as the AP, et cetera. So that's sort of what we do. We publish about 10 to 12 stories a day. We have a pitch process. We get stories in two ways. One, we have a daily news meeting where we think of ideas and we go out and seek scholars. We have researchers who look for experts in the field. And I never knew it before I got to the conversation, but there's an expert in every single field, no matter how narrow, I think, in academia. The second thing we do is we get hundreds and hundreds of pitches each week from academics all over the country saying, I discovered why zebras don't have stripes, or, why they have stripes, or a finding on, Trump's latest salvo or something. And we accept about 15 to 20% of pitches, which isn't a lot, but it's quite honestly, a few of my friends run opinion sites, and that seems to be larger number than they accept, because many of these opinion sites and or idea sites Brian can speak to, and Kathryn, I'm sure, are inundated with just so much attention from potentially academics who want to write. So to write for us, it's pretty easy. We ask everyone, no matter who you are, doesn't always work out that way, but go through, we have a pitch portal, super simple. And it said you sign up for it. You just show that you have to have an academic affiliation. It could be an adjunct. It could be, we're not super strict, but you have to be an expert in what you want to write about too. And so really, we can talk about it more lately, but it's really simple. It's like, what would your headline be for your story? If you were in a few words, what would your headline be? And that really, it's only 50-word limit you have to really think about in a really quick way, the main point you're trying to get across. And then we ask you for the main points, why you're an expert on the topic. And then we always ask, we're very strict about conflicts of interest. You have to disclose them. And oftentimes we say no to people because their conflicts we feel are too great that the story would be the conflict was too great to avoid a perception of bias. So I think that's it for the conversation so far, and I'm eager to talk more. So,
Well, thank you
Thank you.
for those thoughtful answers. Okay, so I'm sure many in this space are experts, right? They want to make people think, as Beth was just saying. So how do you determine where to go next? How do you determine there's so many possible sites to share our expertise on? Do you have advice on how academics should think about making these connections and reaching out to particular sections or news sites? Let's see, Katie, why don't we begin with you this time and we'll loop through the other way.
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the things that I frequently tell people is, where do you like to read, and where are perhaps where are some colleagues in your field? Where are they writing? And because we obviously serve a very niche audience. We're very much about history, and so we have people. Mostly historians we work with, but we also work with people in journalism and political science and sociology who are thinking historically about certain concepts. But a history pitch is going to do well at Made by History. So, I would just kind of think about different outlets that tend to, publish on technology in interesting ways. And so my go-to is always like, there are some certain sections of the Atlantic that I read regularly. And then I know that, this editor tends to work with historians. So I would have more success because they have this audience that is thinking through the topics that I'm interested in writing on. They already have that audience. And so again, a good way to think about possible outlets is where you're finding really interesting articles that are being written on the topic that you're interested in writing. And especially if you have colleagues that are publishing, think about those particular sites, reach out to them and say, you really enjoyed this article. Could they put you in touch with an editor? Sometimes knowing an editor directly is much easier to kind of get their attention than necessarily just submitting, to a standard email as well.
yeah, that's really good advice. I have a couple other pieces. I think that asking the author of a piece you like to help you get in, I often get, well, not I, but our staff often gets pitches that is simply just to opinion or advocacy based, but we want to help people find other outlets. And it's really hard to pitch blindly to a site. Like, I don't know, US News and World Report now has a pretty good and growing opinion site run by a former Globie, actually, Indira Lakshmanan. And it's really hard to get her attention, even when they republish all the time. So I think I think for academics, I would also go to your communications team sometimes if you have it in a college. I think they can be very useful and help you think through it, and they may have some connections. The other thing I'd say, which is look, everyone I talk to wants to be in the Washington Post and the New York Times or the Atlantic. Like, it just is. Like, that's what people read in our, like, I think in our world. And I offer up a counter thought, which is maybe if you're writing on something, you may want to get people to think differently by writing for a completely different outlet that you never would have done before. And I think that really would, I just think that we're not very pluralistic anymore in America about having diverse opinions in different news outlets. And this is a plug. I'm being kind of like a plug for the conversation here. But if you get into the conversation, you're going to be in 24 news outlets, period. And they're all over the country. And they're in red states and blue states. And I think that's really valuable, not only for careers, but also for the public good, to have these ideas out in news outlets that no longer have probably the experts and thought that you all bring. So I hope that's clear. I'm a little getting over a bug, so I'm a little not too articulate today, but.
Beth, if I could just add to that, I've written for the conversation before, and one article that I wrote was picked up in Fortune magazine, The Nation. I mean, it was just, and I think a variety of other newspapers, but it was really striking to me how diverse the public, again, The Nation and Fortune. Interesting, right? Two very, very different demographics.
Just another idea.
I actually hadn't thought of the framing, Beth, that you just mentioned, but I love it. And I'm not surprised that it's so spot on, because the truth is that I think someone with expertise and something to say can have more impact writing in places that are in publications that are less likely to have a lot of expertise at the ready. So, the difference you can bring is probably you're likely to write a much smarter, op-ed than what some other small publication would otherwise publish. So if you go to, if there's some local angle and you can pick, I don't know, a newspaper, a one-off newspaper someplace, it's tough because so many publications have really, really small opinion staffs now. But I guess the real question you asked that I'm supposed to answer is, why, how should you think about approaching, say, if you want to approach like ideas? I think it's very hard to do, because I know a lot of people are trying to pitch a lot of places, but I think it's really helpful to be at least somewhat familiar with what that publication is already regularly doing. So like we get pitches sometimes that I'm just like, if anyone has read us, more than like three or four pieces in us, they would know that's just not a piece we run. Or the flip side of that is you can actually see by reading a publication regularly, this is the way a certain subject is getting framed all the time. And it could be not even on the op-ed pages, but even in the news pages of that publication. And you could sort of say, aha, I think this is being framed in an incomplete way, or the wrong way, or the people who say, to Kathryn's point, the people who say they're historians are actually not, or whatever it is. So I think that like seeing where some kind of coverage is already happening, and thus like reader conversations are happening, I think that's like, if you have something to say, jump in then. I happen to think that like our letters to the editor are a great indicator of what people really want to talk about. We happen to get, I'm blown away by how smart our readers are and how committed they are. And they write great letters to the editor, and they always come up with like framings I didn't think of about pieces we've run. And you can just see that there's certain topics that people are writing in about a lot. And so if you see like, oh, they're writing about this thing and I'm an expert in that thing, like I would go for it. I wouldn't overthink it to be like, oh, you just had a piece on this, I don't want to pitch it. Just pitch it, because when a subject is important and is really resonating, like there's always more to say. No one opinion piece is ever the last word on a subject. Like it's just not meant to be. It can't be.
Yeah, I was just going to add, oh, sorry. It's add one thing. I think that's so smart, Brian. Yeah, it isn't. And that gets to like when you're pitching, let me what we're going to talk about, but think of like the one point you're trying to make, because you can't talk about the whole kitchen sink ever.
Well, can I just add to that? This is the hardest things I find that academics struggle with when they write for us. We really, really try to convey that you get to convey one idea in a piece. Maybe you can try 1.1 ideas, but like one idea. And I will say that the conversation is, I think, masterful at that discipline. I feel like every piece I read in the conversation is about one idea only. It's crisply defined. It is of like crystalline clarity and explanation, and then it gets off stage. And that is like a model of how to write these kinds of pieces, I think. Like I don't think we execute on that as well as we should or could. But anyway, the one idea is like probably my number one bit of advice.
Yeah, I completely agree. A lot of times when I have maybe a graduate student or a colleague that comes and says, "Oh, I have an idea for this," they actually like, "I want to look at the political, economic, and cultural," and I'm like, "Pick one." Those are three different pieces, and that actually is really exciting because that means you have three pieces. And just to hammer that point home, for my last, I think my first book was published in 2014. I have wrote over 20 different op-eds based off of that book. They were all a little bit different. Some were very narrowly focused on one particular moment, but I mean, I made different arguments because you have multiple arguments in your work, and so I could focus on different angles for depending on the news hook, depending on what made sense to really help clarify certain issues. So it's not just a one and done. I encourage you to constantly be thinking about different pieces and how as well.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Great, thank you. Please feel free to bounce ideas off one another as we answer these questions. So now I'm going to pivot to something that's very practical. We know from writing op-eds that the turnaround for writing and editing can sometimes be really fast. And so can you give us a brief overview of what the writing, editing, publishing process looks like at your publication, right? Thinking about how folks can fit this into their regular work schedules.
Should I start?
Yes, we'll start off with
I didn't
Beth
know
and
if
then we'll
okay,
go back through the
yeah.
alphabet.
So this is like I know there's a joke somewhere in the New Yorker about this, but we often say we're having a news meeting and something just the Pope's in critical condition. I'm like, okay, let's get 3 stories ready to go, the note written so we can blast it out to all the news outlets. Let's get that done like the next 4 hours. And then we reach out to all the academics who study the Pope, and we say, oh, we got to get this out really fast. Or like, oh, good, is 3 weeks okay? Like it just starts like there's just I got to be honest, there's often a incredible disconnect between the timing of what is considered fast in academia and what is, I would say, truly fast in journalism. And so it's an interesting thing. I mean, the conversation when we commission stories, some stories are done in 6 months, some are done in 3 weeks, some are done in 2 hours. And we sit on the phone with the scholar and we write through it together. I mean, sometimes you have to do that in service of the news, in service of the context being brought to people. But it's really hard because I feel, and Brian and Kat, well, probably Brian, like, correct me. It's like journalists want to get everything just right too, but oftentimes we're willing to get the main point across, and we feel that's good enough. In academia, what I've learned, because I don't certainly come from an academic background, is that words are so important, and certain words signal to people in your field that you know something. It's kind of like it feels like a secret language sometimes. It feels to me. And it's very hard for academics to let go of some language points. But if the public doesn't understand that language, it's hard. And so that also, that comes in the service of time also, because the editing takes long. So I'll stop there. I don't really have an answer to it, but we work with each other.
Great, thank you. So next, Brian, what does the timeline look like at the Globe?
It's for us in ideas. So I think in the other more daily focused opinion section, they'll look for quicker turnarounds off the news. But like Beth, we work on 6-month time frames, 3-month, 3-week, never 2 hours really. That's just not, we're just not doing that. What we're doing in ideas is really like a kind of like a magazine tucked inside the Sunday newspaper. The Globe also has a Sunday magazine, but we have a sort of more like magazine sensibility in terms of just the metabolism and the Sunday read kind of vibe. So yeah, one big reason pitches fail with us is they come in and they're reacting to something that happened a day or 2 ago, and we would just rather kind of look ahead, or the thing that happened a day or 2 ago is so monumental that it's going to be worth reading about the following Sunday. So a good example of that is I have a couple pieces. The Trump-Zelensky blow up in the Oval Office was Friday, the 28th. But it's kind of like this huge sea change and this big moment that will, be remembered for a long time. It's okay to have pieces coming up about it this coming Sunday, 9 days after the event. Um, but that's kind of like an exception that, we try not to write kind of off the news. We use being an opinion as a little bit of like a liberating, um, like mission statement in that we can be not news. It doesn't mean every piece has to have like a real like opinionated take, but it just means we just don't have to be news. So we want to, use that freedom. We like to ask a lot like what if or why not, and kind of, we're hoping to challenge conventional wisdom. We're hoping to get people to see things they think they already know in a new light. And so timeliness, urgency is not a value to really optimize for in that context. And there was something else I was going to say about that, but about the process. Once a piece comes in, it can take, sometimes pieces come in and, any one of us will make a first pass. We run it by a second reader who's doing like a gut check, then it gets a copy edit. So those 3 reads, those like 3 stations of the cross, whatever, each one can kind of like be of varying duration. Like sometimes pieces need many, many weeks to kind of like, I'll send a piece back to writers sometimes 4 or 5 times. Sometimes it's just like once. So I think some writers get frustrated with us because they're like not prepared for how like thorough we fact check, how much we gut check premises, that like nuance check, not just fact check. Most writers say they like it. Some people are like, "Ugh, why can't I get this published yet?" Most writers, I think, appreciate it and like it. And just to echo one last thing that Beth said is that the jargon thing is really huge. That's something we will almost always push back on, like preferred wording. That tends to make pieces take longer too. Like if we put in an edit to take out some bit of jargon and we put in something that's much more conversational, if we have to kind of like litigate every change like that, it can take forever. And to support what Beth was saying, we really are pretty firm on that because like at the end of the day, my colleagues and I, we're advocates for the reader. We're not actually here in service of the writer who wants to place a piece. Like we're kind of brokers for the reader. And if this sounds kind of harsh, but I mean, if a writer is like sticks their, this doesn't really happen that much. So I don't even know why I'm going to tell you this, but it has happened from time to time. If someone's going to be like, I have to use this piece of jargon or this like, preferred nomenclature, which is really hard to parse, but I have to use it because in my field it means something, like we will walk away. You know what I mean? Because that's that important to say, like, trust us. You are the expert in your field, but like we are the you of knowing how to write reader friendly stuff. So anyway, that sometimes make pieces take longer than they might otherwise, be expected to take. Sorry for going on for too long about that.
No, Brian, it's a
Very
really
helpful.
good point. That was actually, so before we worked with Time, we were partnering with the Washington Post, when Outlook was a thing. That was actually one of the first things that our editors at Outlook told us. And he's like, your responsibility is to the reader and to make sure that this piece is as clear, as factual, and as easily accessible as possible. And so that was something that we've always had in mind as well. And we constantly are pushing back of we can't talk about historiography. We can't have like the literature review. We also, sometimes if your ideas are really central to, or you're building off of a book, one book that plays a really prominent role in how you're thinking about certain things, you can include the name of that historian or that scholar, but only one per piece. There's a tendency to say as so and so shows and as so and so shows, and you can link and you can actually cite these pieces with hyperlinks and to show that, but you can't shout out scholars nonstop because that is also something that makes it much more inaccessible to a non-scholar reader. But to that point, and what am I supposed to be answering? Okay, what does the process look like? So we do move quickly sometimes with the news. I think since we've switched to Time Magazine, we have a little bit, news cycles are a little bit longer than they were when we were with the Post. But we will turn pieces around really quickly if they come in and they're tied to the news. And the news factor is something that we're looking for as we kind of evaluate whether or not to take a piece. Is it connected to something that's happening right now? So we can turn around pieces. We have turned them around before in a day, but generally I would say that they take about 3 to 4 days, where you would submit and you would work with one of the senior editors, me or one of my 2 colleagues. And the first round of edits is pretty rigorous, and that's I know working with the conversation is very similar in that capacity, where I'll go through and I'll say, can you condense it? I'll do some line editing. I'll ask questions. It's really to kind of make sure that the argument is there. So it's a really substantive edit for the first round that will then kind of take some time to respond to that feedback. And then the second edit goes through, similar to what it sounds like happens at the Globe and the Conversation, is that we also have a second editor that reads everything, that again, to make sure it flows for fact checking, but also for gut checking, as Brian mentioned as well. And then once a piece is really polished and pretty ready to go, the copy desk does a final look and goes again through fact checking of everything as well. And so that's where you can kind of get very minor questions, but it's rooted in kind of trying to make sure that everything is as accurate as possible.
Yeah, can I just add to that? And props, honestly, if you read the idea section, read Made by History, like it's compelling and readable because all that jar, like everything's stripped away in service of the reader. And that's like, yeah, it's really hard to do. And you both do a great job at it.
Yeah.
We can be more, we're in service of the academic, like we service the reader, but our goal is to get the academic into a place where they will become a public scholar, whatever that means. So we try to work with them. And so there's a lot of negotiation going on, but again, similar process, lots of edit, three rounds of edits, final kind of libel check. And then for us, both the author and the scholar have to press a button that says we approve. Like you have to actually approve it, the scholar, before it goes live. So it's very collaborative. So yeah.
Yeah, I would add that we actually have legal also can look at certain pieces. And this is something as a scholar, like kind of surprised me that like, well, but if you're talking about a corporation, right? That there are journalistic standards in terms of and expectations for how you make sure that they are given an opportunity to respond. There are ways to pull from the public record to do that, but legal can also do a review, especially if your piece is about a person or an organization that still exists.
Thank you. I want to switch tacks here a little bit and return to a point Brian made earlier. You said you know it when you see it, talking about pieces that stand out to you. But I'm going to be a little bit of a skeptic on this. I think you do probably know it when you see it, but it helps if that person is a senior scholar who's written 3 books, or it's a longtime contributor, let's say, to the idea section. So I want to know what advice you 3 would offer to the novice, the person who's never published an op-ed before, or perhaps a really early stage scholar who's hoping that they can share some of their dissertation with a wider public. What strategies would you recommend to that person so they get the notice? Brian, maybe you can start us off.
Honestly, I really don't think like a senior scholar or someone who's a well-published expert has a leg up. I mean, for one thing, like most readers don't know. These ideas really have to kind of live and die of their own like level of validity and how compelling they are. And to be honest, like the more senior scholars can really just be more likely to be prima donnas and difficult to work with. I mean, we love finding new writers. That's like part of what we feel like we're here to do. So if anything, I think like a junior scholar or dissertation with something to say, there might even be like not more points for it, but uh, yeah, I really don't think that's the issue. Um, we really just want to read it and be like, oh, that's something we want to put in front of readers. I mean, like, I feel a real sense of duty. Like, I feel really lucky that the ideas section even exists. Like, in this stage of journalism, 2025, like, we could fill it with pieces that like have some sort of, I don't know. I feel like this real sort of internal pressure to like put things out there that readers are like, oh, I would never have found that if not for this. And so I think a piece by an unknown scholar is more likely to fit that bill rather than being like, oh yeah, I've read this guy. He's written 6 books. You know what I mean? But anyway, to answer your question, I would just make it very, very clear in the pitch that here's the simple, clear one idea. And here's why I think it's important. Let me back up actually, because I think there's one maybe misconception here is that we tend to not say yes or no based on pitches. We usually see a full draft. It's kind of, I mean, it's hard, but for people to write kind of on spec like that, but that's what I mean by when you see it. Like either a draft just has that clarity, it kind of snaps with the confidence of its ideas. It's rooted in reality. It's not hand wavy. By hand wavy, it means like it's just kind of saying stuff that's like, all right, this may or may not be true, but it's like really just bringing it. I'm sorry, you just really do know it when you see it. And so writers, again, who I think are exemplifying a lot of things that Beth and Kathryn have also mentioned, that they're bringing something that's original, fresh, surprising, clearly expressed, and kind of concisely done, well written. It's just once you hit those marks, I just feel like you're very close. And we may pass just for some other reason, like we have too many stories on a subject at any given week or month or something like that. But even in that case, we'll often say to somebody, hey, we're not going to take this pitch, but we really like the way you write. We really like the way you think. Could we do another piece? What about this? Or, way down in the 10th paragraph, this is another reason it's good to get a whole piece. Way down in the 10th paragraph, you mentioned this really interesting thing. I haven't read on that before. Could that be a piece? Could we come back to you in 6 months when so-and-so is going to be in the news? So I guess it's like write well and be open to, that kind of like give and take.
Yeah. I think that's really good advice. It's like, when you see it, and because I get asked this question all the time. And sometimes I tell people like, look, if you're completely moved by some news that affects your expertise that's going on, and you're emotionally inclined because you want to tell people your point of view on it, don't pitch a conversation because I'll tell you, everyone else is pitching the conversation with the same sense of emotion and the same sense of, so what I tell people to do is wait a day, sleep on it, and come up with what about your research is going to tell some context or comparative information that will make people just look at through a different lens, not just to say this is bad or this is good, but some sort of, and this is what made my history does so well, and like just something that just alters your, and obviously the ideas too, but alters your viewpoint just a smidge. It doesn't have to be a lot, because there are so many angles on stories that people don't ever get to because people are so myopic on the must say that's bad, must say that's wrong, or must say that's good. So I think that's a piece of advice I'd give when pitching. And the last thing is really work hard. I mean, socialize it with your friends, make up a headline or your sentence and run it by someone. And if they don't understand it, no one else will either. Like it's a cocktail party test, right? Go pretend you're at a cocktail party, explain what you want to write about to someone in like a sentence or two. And if they're looking at you nicely and smiling, but you can tell they totally don't get it, well, it's not going to fly either, So socialize the idea, bounce it around with people, and it'll help you. It's not just all in your head sometimes. It's my
I use the cocktail party reference all the time. Like, because I think that it's true. And I mean, I think it's not about credentials in terms of how senior you are, how many books you've written. It's about clarity, clarity of ideas. And I think it's not, people who are farther along in their career might have more confidence to make bigger arguments. But I do think that it's about an original argument. Sometimes I completely agree with Brian. Like, the most difficult people I have worked with are those that, will not budge in their thinking and think that they know better than me as a younger woman. And so I think that can be difficult. And so being coachable and being open to new ideas, I think, is also really important. And to say, this is what I'm thinking, but I'm open to feedback, and really, really taking serious that feedback that you get during the process will make it a better article. And will establish a relationship, a really good working relationship with editors as well, that's something, again, that I think is really important, that if you are lovely to work with and you don't fight over every single word, but understand that you're trying to make this the best piece for a non-academic as possible, you'll be able to cultivate those relationships. And then, they publish with them again, and just kind of grow your networks as well, because I think that's another key thing.
Excellent advice. Thank you for challenging me or making me revise my thinking on that. I appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. Great answers. I think I'm actually going to not do the question I have on my list, but kind of follow up on this conversation here, and no pun intended to Beth. So sometimes when we read op-eds or write op-eds, there's kind of a formula where paragraph 2, people mention their positionality as someone who experienced X or someone who has written about X for 20 years. And so I think that's maybe another theme that's embedded in Ariane's question. So is that important for someone to put in their pitch what their relationship is, their expertise, whether personal or academic?
That's a good question. Yes and no. Well, yes. Okay, you should. So, yeah, look, a story, opinion, or we do news too, we're often on the news pages, but we're a lot on the opinion pages. Putting in your personal connection to something, why you study something, is really, really makes it come alive for people. Because you see, I study this wonderful scholar who studies young African-American girls, like gravitating towards white dolls and black dolls. And she embarked on the study because she has a young child who gravitated, like, very, very poignant. It was a very interesting study. Where people can, at least for the conversation, this may not be, where people can really run into trouble is I'm trying to be articulate about it, but they become blinded to fairness and objectivity because they are they are a victim of something, and they study that as a victim or as someone of a particular class, not always a victim, but as a particularly underrepresented person. And that can be very tricky because while lived experience, and I may be going a little bit out on a limb here, while lived experience is super important, it has to be balanced with the research. And we have found many times, unfortunately, that it's across every field, that it can get very tricky about what becomes an advocacy position versus research. And I know research is supposed to be the gold standard, and of course there's research, and it's more complicated than that. You can have a lot of findings in research, and they can and bias can be behind them or drawn from them. So again, sorry, I'm getting over the fluid. My brain is not completely on, but that's really dangerous, And so we really try to work with people. We try to work with people ahead of time, saying, look, you want to write this, but your findings, maybe we could work on the findings and just focus on the research part of it. Mention your lived experience, mention who you are and your relationship to it, but not go so deep into it. It clouds the findings for an uninformed reader who's supposed to draw their own conclusions.
Yeah, I think the credential, like your relation to it, how you're an expert on it. I think that is important for the pitch for us to say. And I think you pitch the idea. Here's what's happening for us in the news. Here's what's missing from our understanding of it. Here's what I'm going to deliver. Here's my argument. And then here's why I'm the perfect person to write this. And that just really can be as simple for us. I mean, we don't need to know that you grew up where you grew up. We don't need to know your personal story, but we do need to know your professional expertise. And to say, if you're, I teach a class on the history of pandemics, and I publish, or I'm a professor here. I teach in this capacity, and I publish these books. All of that is something that's important for the pitch, but we won't have that in the article. And so, we'll kind of eliminate that because we want the piece itself to just foreground those findings. But that can be useful for the pitch as to kind of establish your expertise. And, to Ariane's earlier question, you don't have to have written 3 books on this. Just saying that you're a PhD student writing a doctoral dissertation on this makes you an expert on that. And so that's part of your expertise when you're pitching as well.
This is so interesting to me. I think actually, this might sound like a thought experiment, but I can back this up with real examples. I agree exactly with what Kathryn said in terms of like the expertise or whatever, how someone came to know something is really interesting for us as we figure out who we're going to work with or why a piece is coming from a place of a good faith place, for example. But I think it's possible. Like imagine we have a historian who writes a piece for us, and they're distilling all of this information to write this piece. In theory, a non-historian who read a bunch of books and went to some historic site or whatever could have come up with the exact same body of evidence to write a piece, making the same argument and the same claims and pointing out having the same sort of scoop of perception. So what I'm saying is like to the reader, what comes across should not be dependent on positionality or expertise, even if the expertise kind of helps us feel comfortable about doing a piece. But we come out of like a journalistic tradition where you don't need to have any expertise. You can figure stuff out. You can go out with a unanswered question and try to get it answered and show readers what you found. So in other words, like if the same words were written by a historian and by a lay person, but the layperson just kind of happened to read the book that the historian wrote, like both pieces could be equally valid because of exactly this idea that the pieces really have to kind of like work on their own merits without trying to impress the reader with like, oh, the author is donning the vestments of the high priesthood. You know what I mean?
Thank you.
Very, very helpful and kind of reassuring for folks who are entering this field anew. So Ariane, up to you.
Oh, sure. Okay. So as we're moving towards the end of our questions for you, I've heard a lot during this conversation about what we should avoid in pitches, right? So avoiding using too much jargon, overcomplicating ideas, extensive literature reviews. And I've also heard quite a bit from the 3 of you about what we should be prioritizing: clarity, distillation of ideas, relevance, or kind of a clear connection to a significance. Are there any particular strategies or topics we haven't addressed yet, I guess I should say, either what we should be avoiding or what we should really be cultivating in our pitches as we identify publications?
Beth, you go first.
No. Mine is really simple. I would say sometimes the best pitches come from a collaboration of 2 disparate interdisciplinary fields. It's really interesting when you get 2 scholars together and they, like a physics professor and a history professor. I mean, it's actually fascinating. And we've been experimenting with that. It's some of our most popular and distinctive stories. So, but that takes time.
That's interesting because I think that can lead to a version of the kind of piece I was going to suggest. I think one trope of op-eds is that they feel kind of preachy or formulaic, or like, here's problem X in the world. People are thinking about it wrong. They should think about it this way. I just think a very successful kind of piece that some people are really open to, but some people wouldn't kind of know that it's okay to do this kind of piece, is the like the piece that began not with here's information I'm very eager to impart, but a piece that began with a question. I, the writer, was really curious about why so and so is the way it is, or how did it get this way, or why can't we change this? And the piece, the through line, the narrative, the story of the piece is actually walking readers through the exploration they went on to try to answer that one main question. Again, it's all in the service of one idea. There's certainly expertise and intelligence and experience driving the quest, but like pieces that's almost like meet the readers on a level of like a little bit of humility. Like, I wondered this thing. Let me get you interested in why this is an interesting question. And now let me bring you along with what I found. Like, obviously not all pieces want to be that. Like, we talk a lot about what pieces kind of want to be, but when a piece is like ripe for that, that's just gonna be something to try. And I don't know if it would help if I gave examples, but there's one in particular ideas piece that comes to mind about this. And it was a piece that came in, I still can't even believe our luck on this. It came into the general submission line by a really incredible writer and historian at Harvard, Taya Miles, who like around 2021 had been to like a plantation, one of the few plantations in the South that actually managed to like tell the story, the history of it honestly. And she was like, oh, that's interesting. So many of these places have been like quite literally whitewashed. They become like wedding venues, and the story of what went on in these southern plantations isn't really told. And she wrote this piece that's kind of like, not, let me tell you how plantations should tell their story. It was, how should we think about these places? What should we do? And she kind of like brought you along on this journey that she herself as a curious scholar went on. And I think it was one of our best pieces we did that year, because it did end on a point. She did have an argument to make, but it unfolded in this really like conversational, natural way. And I don't know. I just think like the fact that like a very, very highly regarded scholar chose that as her entry point, rather than just like kind of like being like, here's what I'm going to tell you. Now stand back and listen, I think is just like a brilliant model.
Yeah, I don't know, Kathryn, because I'm gonna put the word humility made me think of a story that I loved at the conversation that incorporated, I think, a little bit of what you're talking and things we've been talking about. I'm just gonna put it in the chat if you have a chance to read. Like, it was a story that was very moving, and it was narrative, and but it was research based, so it just was interesting. May not be for everyone, but I really liked it, and it got like 2 million reads, literally.
Yeah, I would say that's not the dominant way that our pieces have unfolded, but there have been times that if there's something really compelling in an archive that kind of made you think completely differently about a topic, telling that story of finding that source and raising those questions, I think that could be a really good way to kind of get a piece out there, especially because there are key moments in the cycle of journalism where people are eager for what they call evergreen pieces, and that means that they're not bound by a particular news hook, that they're generally interesting, and they're curious. They generate curiosity, and I highlight this because I think these are things that I didn't know as a scholar before doing this type of work. But in August, people like to take vacations. editors too. And so that's really an opportunity to think, okay, maybe I can pitch a story at the end of July, mid to end of July, that might be for August, that can, and that type of story would do well because it doesn't depend on, what, crazy thing happened that day. And so I think, if there are just really interesting stories that, again, not just fascinate you in a particular field, but that you always find that are really good stories that you tell at cocktail parties, that might be kind of a way to think about, oh, that's a really interesting story. It has to be relevant, right? But that might be something to kind of pre-package for these moments of the year. During the end of December into January. That's another time that people are on holiday and want to take vacations. They still need to publish certain things, but that might be a good, kind of thinking strategically about doing those types of pieces during times when there are kind of lulls in the news cycle, or people just want to take a break. That's a strategic way to pitch those types of pieces as well.
I just want to say that's brilliant advice to think about quiet times and pitch a story then. I forgot. That's so smart. And for us too,
Yeah, and thinking ahead to things that are going to be happening even like 2 months ahead, you're doing the editor a huge favor, because we like to feel like, oh yeah, we're prepared for this thing in August or whatever it is. And when someone tells us about a thing we didn't know of, is going to be happening in August, and here's a piece on it, like it's just incredible. The only like stockpiling a piece for the future is like probably the greatest feeling. So
yeah, it's really, and I will say that it's also really frustrating when someone pitches you on that idea like 2 days before it, and you think that's brilliant. You knew this was coming. Why would you do it right now? We get that with like historical anniversaries, which I will tell you are not a news hook, even though historians think that they are. But they'll say, "Oh, this is happening tomorrow." I'm like, again, you knew this was coming. So we're not gonna, it's very unlikely that we would try to rush and turn around a piece for something that, was on the radar weeks, months, years in advance. Yeah, definitely reach out before then. I'd say, a month in advance is a really good time to kind of think about when to reach out for that.
Great, terrific, thank you. So in a moment, we will pivot to our Q&A from the audience, but this is our speak now or forever hold your peace moment. What final idea, advice, tidbit would you like to share with us today? Anything you haven't been able to say already?
I'll just make it like it, from what I've learned about academia, it doesn't always reward public scholarship. I mean, not every university is Purdue or Michigan or or even BU, where this public scholarship actually matters for promotion and tenure. But I would say find a way to do it if you can. Even make it your goal 1 a year, because it's so critical that the research that you're doing, you're doing it, I suspect, for the public, to make the world a better place. And if the public doesn't know about it, I don't know what happens, So that's my emotional pitch to like go for it, even though it's hard and you're not going to get paid for it probably, or paid very little. I think it's really important.
I'll follow up to Beth's point and say that it also can be professionally advantageous as well. I did not get promoted based off of this work, but it did factor into my tenure file. And it did, beyond that, it's created really great opportunities to sharpen my writing. I loved it. Like I once worked on an article about a journal, academic journal article about Gerald Ford and SNL, while I was also writing a piece about SNL for Time magazine. And the editing process for Time actually sharpened what I was writing for the academic journal. And so really, having someone say, why does this matter? What are you really trying to say? It's going to make you think more critically about your research. The editing process will make you a better and a stronger writer. And then you could also point to this when you're applying for grants. Granting agencies like to see impact. This is a measure of impact, and you can even get the statistics from the conversation, especially. It's very clear who and how many people are reading. So it can help your applications for different grants. It also helps other scholars become aware of your work. I guarantee that more people in my field have know my work because they've read a 1,000-word piece that I wrote than actually have read my book. And I'm okay with that because I really want them to know my work, and then maybe to then engage with my book in different ways because they first saw this 1,000-word piece. And it can create professional opportunities. I was invited to work with the Museum of Motion Pictures because of a piece that I worked on. And so again, just to say that you're doing, I think it's a really public good that you're doing. I think it's really important in our society to have more of this fact-based research, but there are also tremendous professional advantages that go beyond the promotion and tenure, but really allow you to expand your academic and professional networks as well.
That's a great point.
Great.
I think if this, okay, say one thing, we have statistics, if this matters, people like 20% get asked to do a book deal. I don't know how many we actually do a book deal. 75% get asked to speak on public radio or another broadcast outlet. So like there's like, as Kathryn saying, there's a long tail collaboration, better citations, because everything's hyperlinked. It really, it does help. And I think I was speaking more from sort of the more or less moralistic point of view, but it definitely can help.
Absolutely. Moral and public attention, all good. So Brian, did you have any last lingering thoughts to share on this point or another point?
No, I mean, I think I've said most of my best advice. The only thing I just would come back to the cocktail party analogy in a different way, which is to say that like I think we try to think of like what we're doing as like hosting a cocktail party where like every time we publish somebody, we're telling readers, hey, you got to go meet this person over here. He or she has this really incredible story to tell. Now go, so like come with the sense that like you want to be someone to be introduced at a cocktail party with, like have it at that level. It's funny how much the time the cocktail party metaphor comes up, but I think it's a good way to think about it.
Terrific, thank you. And dissertation writers also get that advice, a cocktail party summary of their dissertation. So this has been incredibly helpful, and I'm sure that our audience members have questions. In fact, we have one in the chat right now. And so audience members, feel free to make your faces seen to us or not based on your comfort level. You can enter your questions either in the chat or just raise your hand, and we will put your question on the floor. So hi, Rachel, there we go, a brave person. So we have our first question from Kate Kerwa. And Kay, feel free to elaborate, but I'll read it. Panelists, could you highlight a piece or two or piece types that gained very high engagement and readership levels in your publications? So what was super successful?
I mean, for us, the pieces that do well are the ones that challenge conventional wisdom and challenge orthodoxy. Say that a favorite bit of terminology is empty, and really go after it. Our readers seem to love that. And the target of that could be all over the map. But I just find that people feel it's refreshing when someone says something that's kind of wanted to be said, or they didn't know wanted to be said, but they're kind of glad someone said it.
Great, thank you. Other responses to Kate's question?
Made by History launched in 2017 in June, and the Charlottesville attacks happened that August. That is the piece that I just put in the chat. That is, it asked that question, right? That people were wondering, Trump made something about and like referenced Antifa, and it was like, what is this? And just that question really answered something that people were wondering. And they were able to kind of challenge Trump's characterization of what Antifa was. This piece, again, because it answered this pressing question that people had as they were trying to make sense of things as it unfolded. This did very well. This is actually the best piece that we've ever published. I think it got, in one day, it got over 2 million clicks, which is a lot for us. And like, other parts of the post probably have more than that. But for a history section that was brand new. And I think that, when our section has done very well on some of these enduring pieces, sure, but I think we thrive when there have been crises that people are really trying to figure out what happened. When we ran a piece that Kate Macer at Northwestern wrote right after January 6th, trying to kind of explain like what happened. And I think that that's actually where we thrive. When we've seen a lot of unprecedented things over the past, well, now almost decade. And so I think that that's actually where our pieces have done very, very well, because there's a thirst to understand. And if we can turn pieces around really quickly, and on these, we stayed up late to do that, we can really fulfill this important role.
Yeah. I put one in there. It really depends on the subject, but again, honestly, I feel like we try to write really nuanced, thoughtful, contextual stories, the ones that do best. What is a constitutional crisis? Like simple question like that. What does it mean? What does the Department of Education do? Like those have always done incredibly well. So for us, those kind of, and you add the context in there, but it's sort of trying to make people understand our democracy and how it works.
Terrific. Thank you. So we have 2 questioners in the queue. First we have Rachel, and then we have Neve. So the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks so much. This was really informative. I actually recently wrote for the conversation and found the editing process really helpful. So just a shout out to you guys. I had a kind of 2 questions. One is, I recently had a project that I was working with undergrads on, and they were helping me do research, and I was like trying to brainstorm with them. Are there places that you would even accept like undergrads, kind of like, I was thinking either we could collaborate or, I could coach them in writing something for a more popular publication. And I felt like you guys were saying like you're open to different levels of expertise, but I just want to check on that if like, or I advise undergrads on their senior theses, and they do become experts in those topics. So I wanted to ask that. And then the second one was like a little more specific to something that Brian, you said regarding the Boston Globe. I'm just trying to think about the balance between like writing an entire piece in advance and then pitching it versus like having some sense of like, okay, like the framing that's being looked for, or the even, yeah, I guess I'm sort of, because my experience with the conversation, and I don't know if this was typical, but it was like a bit more of like pitch, and then I was like, knew kind of like the general word count and kind of, had some guidelines. And also for me, knowing that I have a deadline and like I don't know, having that set up is helpful. So, but it sounded like you were saying it's more just like send the thing when it's written. So I'm trying to think about how to balance that, like the having a whole thing that's written where you're not sure if it's going to work for a certain thing versus like pitching something.
Yeah. So just to take those in order, I mean, I really promise we are like extremely promiscuous about who we will publish. Like it could be an undergrad, it could be someone who's like of no expertise at all. Like we published just regular people writing about their lives. They just want to write a piece, and if it works and it checks out, like good. So absolutely, undergrad is like probably several even levels up the expertise chain of some, above some other people we've published. But that's just kind of like, because what we do is a little weird, right? so that's what I mean about that's not necessarily true for a lot of publications. I hear you. It's a lot of work to write a piece. I think maybe the way to kind of bridge the difference is to say that if you have a notion, if you have an intuition that something might be a good piece, if you were pitching us, you could say, hey, I write about this, I researched this. Do you think this would be a good piece? There are definitely things we can kind of rule out, dismiss out of hand, just because the best version of that piece doesn't sound that great for us. But all I'm saying is I think we would say, oh, that does sound interesting. If you want to take a crack at writing it, we can consider it then. And so that's maybe the difference. We could probably spare you the trouble of writing a draft. We do sometimes accept, we will greenlight based purely on pitches. That just is that is true. It's just harder to make that leap. And so, it's almost like the more amazing it probably would be, the more likely we are to kind of take a flyer on it.
Thank you.
Well, we're all different, but yeah, we really want to work with the scholars, Rachel, great work with RFK stuff. I just lost track of what I was going to say. For undergrad, I have an idea. I mean, we don't like to we'll write the names of the undergrad in the copy of the story, but we won't give them byline, just because you need that expertise that's built up. At least we have so many people trying to write for us that we have strict rules, and if we set a precedent, it's all over. But one thing that's interesting at BU, and I don't know, there's a lot of effort at BU in particular where it's mostly in the journalism students, undergrads, where they're writing for the general public, journalism, right? Traditional journalism for Brookline News, for the Boston Globe on occasion, for investigative. But I think there's great opportunity to, if the research local, or if it's semi-local, to go to a different kind of outlets you're not that familiar with, which is this nonprofit news ecosystem that's really being built up. So I think that might be an option. And I think they're not like Brookline News. I live in Brookline, and right by BU, and they're like dying for, I don't want to say dying, but they really need copy of all sorts. And same with the Newton, so that's a possibility. And it looks really, I realize it's not the Boston Globe or a big publication, but it is something that gets students familiar with that idea of public scholarship and writing for the public.
Just to add that we generally don't publish undergrads, but we have had undergrads write with an advisor, perhaps, and that's actually happened quite frequently with like honors theses, where maybe that they'll, so their advisor still kind of also has a byline as well. And that way we kind of ensure that all of the information has been vetted by the faculty that's kind of advising it. And we actually have this brilliant journalism professor at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, I think, Kathy Ford, and she regularly publishes with her undergraduates, and it's a joy working with her because you can see her training the students in the process, but we also know that everything is rigorously fact-checked, so we can trust her expertise as well. And so that's something that we're always open to.
Terrific, thank you. And so Neve's hand is up, and please pronounce your name if I mispronounced it. Thank you for your question.
Yes, my name is Nivi. Thank you.
Thank you.
And my question is, if you have a sense that you do have expertise, you do have something interesting to say, but you're not sure exactly, how to leverage that best, is there an avenue for saying, here's my background, here's what I research, and here are like some things that, I find interesting that we can, that I can comment on based on my expertise, is, besides like something that's like less solid than a formal pitch, but, more open to collaboration as well, that, we're, that one of you or an editor could say like, actually we're looking for, someone who to comment on ABC instead of XYZ, which you pitched.
I mean, I'll take a stab at that, but I don't think I have a good answer, because the answer's probably no. Like, we need a germ of an idea at the conversation. And I think it's just a resource issue, just time, and we have so many people reaching out to us saying, hey, I study this. I'd really like to write for the conversation. Can we get on the phone and talk about what I could do? And it's such a lovely, and if we were a rich nonprofit, we would do it, but we're scrappy, and we just don't have the time to do it. I'm just being really honest about that. One thing I would suggest is talking to another, a colleague, a peer, a mentor about what you think you want to focus in on or what you think is important, and then come back to the conversation or someplace else. We will collaborate, but we just need that germ of an idea. It's too hard to just look at, like, I study that. And I think that's what you're saying. If you're not, forgive me, but I study this. I'm really interested in connecting to the public. Help me figure out how to do that. That's where we struggle. So.
Yes, I would agree with Beth. We've had people who have sent us these emails, like, if you're looking for someone on this, but then they normally get deleted. We get a lot of emails. So I think that, unless it's something that just luck of the draw we happen to just be talking about, I don't think that's ever happened. But what I would say is that, along with talking with colleagues and friends to try to figure out your idea, you might talk with the communications and the marketing people at BU, because they have them there, and I think Beth already mentioned them, but they can be really terrific resources. Most of them have worked in journalism or have worked in media, and so they might be really helpful. And their goal, their job is to get your research into media. So they actually have the time to talk through some of these ideas. So you might and strategize about this as well.
Can I just jump in for a second? I see Sydney, who's in the room, smiling. And I was hoping, Sydney, you could just introduce yourself, building on Katie's last point.
Sure. So I'm the assistant dean for communications for the College of Arts and Sciences. So exactly what Katie was just saying. I'm here to help tell stories, both in our publications, to pitch them to the main BU publications, and then to pitch them externally, or to help you pitch them externally. And also to think about kind of what a story is, and whether something is something that the publications will be interested in. And we do kind of video and social media posts as well. So there's different ways to tell stories. So feel free to reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat. If you have any story ideas, we're always looking.
Thanks, Sydney.
Great. Well, we are just about at time. Are there any last questions that anybody would like to pose? Great. Well, before we all run off to our next meetings, just please take a quick scan through the chat for information on Sydney's office, information on the University Communications Office, and then an ad for an upcoming event on March 24th, organized by the CIS Research Office on communicating your research to broader audiences. And so there were regular workshops on this, not only at CISS and CIS, but throughout the university. So unless there are further thoughts that anybody would like to share, go through the chat here. Let's give a round of applause to our superb panelists. So thank you to Brian, Katie, and Beth. Thank you to Ariane and Shannon for helping us to get this event launched. And thank you, Sydney, for providing your information. I'm sure you'll be hearing from people moving forward.
Thank you, everybody. It's been lovely to have this conversation this afternoon.
Thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely. We're all
Thank you.
inspired to write now. Wishing you a good afternoon.